Hi, I'm Aaron McHale. I'm the director and lead designer for Maiden of Darkness.
And I'm Alex Crespo, and I am essentially chief consultant on this project, but I've had my hand in a variety of areas over the years.
And today we'll be showing off the third chapter of the game, because it's early on in the game and there's not a lot of spoilers, and also it's the most complete.
I know you've spent quite a lot of time on this chapter. It's gone through many iterations throughout the years.
Yeah, mostly because as skill has, developed, we decided that there was more we could do with it, and there was always a certain ideal plateau that I think we finally reached. But every single time a new technique developed, it was like, well, this is the earliest chapter where we're showing off all the new changes, so I think we should probably test them out here first to see how well they do.
Yeah, I remember going through this. As I said, it went through a number of iterations, but we'll get to that in a moment because I think we have a little bit of mechanics to explain before we get going in full.
Yep. So we're going to look at the stats here. There's strength, magic, fighting skill, speed, luck, defense, magic, resistance, constitution, and aid. And also, there are the skill system, which is new to this game. And units have a total hit points. They have a level which is capped at 20, and they gain a level every 100 experience they get.
The variety of stats are usually the more you have, the better your character is.
Yeah, the type of game that we are developing is one where your individual units really matter. Permanent death is a feature, so if a unit dies, then they're just gone for the rest of the game.
It also means that individual units typically have a lot of differences between each other, even if they are of the same class. Like, we have two units that are on horseback here. They can be seen on the map screen with the brown horses. They are both of the Cavalier class, but they have different specializations and different base stats. For example, that red one that was just fighting has a stronger attack power, but the other one is faster, so he can attack more times.
There's a similar comparison between the two axe-using classes on the map. They are both fighters. One of them has a higher rank with axes, meaning he can use more weapons immediately, and is stronger but slower. He'll always hit hard, but he won't always hit twice. The other one is much faster and more defensive, but his hits are more relying on the strength of his weapon than his own strength.
Yeah, so differentiation of individual characters is important in this type of strategy game.
And for example, the White Horse unit is a paladin. That's what we call an advanced class, a unit who has already reached the level cap of 20 and has class changed into a higher class. The White Horse is there as essentially a crutch for new players. Advanced players can still use him tactically, but it's more for if a player is completely new to this game, we'd like for them to be able to play and have something to rely on in case they're still struggling to get into the mechanics.
Yeah, it's basically supposed to be as Aaron mentioned, it's a crutch for new players, so that if they find themselves overwhelmed early on, they have a very powerful unit for this point in the game that should be able to get them through the first few chapters with little trouble. But they will eventually sort of lose a little bit of their strength overall as the game goes on, so some players may elect not to use them.
This one also comes with a weapon that, when it is the enemy phase, they do less damage, so it perfectly sets up enemy units for feeding kills to your weaker units, which help them catch up.
So what you're seeing here now is the player phase is over. We have moved all of our units, and now the enemy is taking their turn. The turns are done asymmetrically, so you do all of your moves, then the enemy does all of their moves, and occasionally on the maps there will be what are referred to as non-player character units, or NPCs, and they are typically marked with green icons on the map. And they are basically computer-controlled allies.
And we just had an example of an effective weapon being used. The thief Chad had a mail breaker which allowed him to do extra damage to an armed knight. See in comparison, the current horse unit Lance, his sword only does 6 damage, and yet Chad, who the player just got on a map that is filled with a lot of armoured units, comes with a special weapon that allows him to sort of keep pace with everyone and to target these units.
Yeah, so a lot of strategy not only comes from using the characters themselves, but also what sort of weapons you equip to them. And when you equip weapons, they all have their own variety of statistics assigned to them, such as the likelihood of hitting an enemy unit in combat, how much damage it will do, and also what's known as critical chance, which is the ability it's the likelihood that the unit will activate a critical hit that does 3 times the amount of damage. So there's a little bit of math involved, there's a little bit of probability involved, and it becomes a very big strategy game, essentially, in terms of just knowing your characters, knowing what they have in their inventories, and knowing what situations are best to put them into.
Another example of something that is involved in the tactical, we just saw Chad walk through enemies. That's because of his skill pass. It allows him to treat the enemies as if they were allied units and just walk through them. And right now we have 2 enemies that are in a perfect pattern, and we're going to move our archer Walt up here, and we're going to take out one knight, and Walt's skill second strike allows him to attack again so long as there is another enemy in range. And we just had an example of leveling up here. When a unit reaches 100 experience, they do level up, and their new stats are calculated by rolling random numbers against their growths. That was that screen earlier we saw when looking at another unit. A unit can possibly level up and gain no stats, and a unit can level up and gain all of the stats. It introduces an element of random chance into the game, which can adjust the way that different players play the game.
For example, if you play the game more than once, you may find the same unit turns out very good in one run and poorly in a different one. It helps keep things fresh should you ever play it again, but it also introduces the whole random aspect to growth, so you may or may not be smiled upon by the random number generator, essentially.
And the player throughout the game will receive essentially what we like to call crutch characters. They're like the paladin, where you gain them at the start. Well, we gain the paladin at the start of the game, and he helps us in that early phase, but you'll gain more units like him, who aren't as good as the units that you haven't had a chance to raise. But they do provide a certain strength that you are unlikely to find just lying around. If the cases happen that your units are just not turning out well and you really need the extra aid, they'll certainly come to your rescue.
So we've talked a little bit about the mechanics at this point, but Aaron, why don't you explain what exactly is going on in this map?
So, this is the 3rd chapter of the game. Our army has just arrived at this fort, and they were intending to meet up with our allied army who was here, but they have been wiped out by the enemy of Bern. So, as you can see, the green unit who was in the cells is Lord Hector. He is an important pivotal figure for the Elysian League, where our player characters come from, and he is currently bleeding out and dying, so you have to reach him in a certain amount of time, otherwise he will die, and you won't fail the chapter, but it will affect events to come. Um, the other character in the cell with him is Bors. Bors is an Arbor Knight who was here to protect and serve with the rest of the army and was lucky enough to survive the battle. And right now we're looking at Lou. These are different events that happen during the chapters. Lou is a mage, and when you reach the house that he's in, or a certain amount of time has passed, Lou will be recruited to the army. He's essentially there to introduce a new kind of mechanic. At this point, the player's only real magic units have been healers. Lou is an offensive caster, which means that he uses the magic stat for his attacks, and he attacks against resistance, whereas most units attack physically against defense. And you can sort of see the benefit that he has fighting against this archer. First of all, archers can't attack in close range, while Lou can attack at range and in close range. And also, because he's attacking against resistance, Lou is dealing 11 damage, and he's certainly fast enough to go twice. So it's one benefit that he has over other units.
Yeah, once magic enters the realm of strategy here, the possibilities expand further, because now you have to consider enemy resistance stat as well. Most foot soldier enemies do not have a high resistance, which makes magic users very appealing, but on the flip side, magic users do not have very much defense, which makes them very weak to most foot soldier units, anyone using swords, axes, bows, or lances. So it becomes a balance of keeping your mage safe, but also using them to dish out high amounts of damage.
We also just had an example there of the weapon triangle function. Previously, when Chad fought an armored knight, he did quite an amount of damage, whereas there he was only doing 5, and he took a hit where he was usually very dodgy. That's because that armor knight was wielding a lance, and Chad is using a sword. Swords are typically very accurate weapons and not very powerful, but they beat axes, so they gain a strength boost and a hit boost when fighting enemies that are currently using axes. Axes beat lances, and lances beat swords. So it's not just important to pay attention to what kind of weapon you're using, but also what the enemy is using.
The rock, paper, scissors nature of this mechanic is very important, especially early on in these games when character stats are not particularly strong. Later in the games, it's not as much important, but it's still something important to keep in mind.
So it's worth pointing out that the mechanics for this game aren't entirely original to this project. This project is actually a modification of a Japanese game that was released in 2002 called Fire Emblem: The Sword of Seals. And this was sort of an attempt to update that game to more modern mechanics and to bring it on par with some of its compatriots. It started out very small. We weren't doing that much to begin with. We were only going to change a few things. And as of right now, the game is completely different to, what I would consider the original game to be. It's different to the point where we could honestly take it, change the characters' names, and get our own original graphics, and we'd be able to very safely call this an original product.
Yeah, there are a few... there's a lot of changes to the maps in this modification. Some of them are seen here. The original section up at the top of the map did not exist. So it has been an extensive modification of the original game at this point.
Yes. It was actually rather difficult because to do this project with the series, I had to get in contact with Intelligent Systems and essentially put it out there that this is what I was doing. And they were fine with it so long as I kept to some very strict rules. And
Intelligent Systems being the original creators of this game, to clarify.
Also to clarify, this game was never released in English. The modification to allow it to be in English was done by fans, some of whom I've worked closely with to make sure that there are no problems with the work that I'm doing, no problems with their work, what remains of their work being used. So this is rather quite an effort. A lot of people worked on this from across the world.
Yeah, we have. Aaron is in Australia. I live in North America. I live in the United States, and a number of people who've assisted with it also live on both, like, the East Coast of the United States and the Pacific Coast of the United States, and sort of everywhere in between. So it's been quite a project over these years. I remember, I think it was 3 years ago was when we first met. Almost like three and a half years, I want to say. And when we first met, because I and some other people were working on a similar project, we spoke with Aaron about the project he was working on, and he had hit a number of stumbling blocks along the way. And my first memory of assisting with this project was essentially getting together with another person online and helping diagnose what had been holding up this project for... How long was it? Was it like...
3 years to that point. It has been a 6-year process in total. We did in fact meet 3 years ago.
Yeah. Basically the project was stuck because the tools for editing were insufficient, and nobody, without knowledge of how to make the tools better, Aaron was essentially just sort of sitting on the project waiting for somebody to come along and make it better. And I remember essentially we sat down, and within 24 hours we had fixed a game-breaking bug that had been plaguing your hack, or not hack, sorry, that's an old term for it. Plaguing this modification for years now. And so that was really funny, essentially, that, oh, we just met, and we just fixed your game.
Yeah, it was something that was incredibly helpful.
Yeah. So that's how we got started, and then over the years it's just been a lot of back and forth on... When I introduced myself as chief consultant. That's a fairly unofficial title. It's mostly... Aaron has talked with me for quite a long time over these years, and he generally just gathers my opinion on changes that he wants to do. But I also mentioned that I did actual contributions to this modification as well. I helped him with design of his original maps. I did just a few days ago the color palette for this map entirely. Modified it to be a little more sightly on the eyes.
The original game and color palette were designed for the Game Boy Advance system, which didn't have a backlight. So a lot of the colours were washed out, because if the colours weren't washed out, then they wouldn't show up on the black screen. So one of the changes that I wanted to make was, given that we were doing such changes to the game, it wouldn't really do, because we do have a backlight now, so I wanted to bring the colours more properly in line so that they would look better to the eye.
So that they would be more vivid and pop out more, that the outlines on characters would be darker instead of sort of a light gray. And in general, just everything became a little more vivid, a little more saturated, and a higher contrast on all of the character art, a lot of the map art, and a number of other assets as well. So that was one area where I helped out with, and it's been very interesting. There's a large learning process with all of this.
What we just saw was another one of the events in this chapter as of the fourth turn. The character Bors, who's been locked in the jail cell, is goaded by one of the bandits outside into breaking out. Getting the screen to shake when he hit the bars, getting the item to drop when he killed the enemy. These were all very difficult things that we had to script very carefully. Originally, the game never handed out items on a phase like this. This was the NPC phase, it would never hand out an item there. So it would actually say the item had been pilfered, which was funny.
I mean, he did break down that jail cell. He did steal the bar from the jail cell, I guess.
Technically, yes. But it was hard because it also. I mean, I would have been fine with it in that case because it is rather funny that yes, he did in fact steal it, but it also played. It also played a jingle that is in reference to having lost something, and sound design wise, it just didn't work to have that jingle be playing when he got the item.
Yeah, it's a little less funny.
I'll leave something in if it's particularly funny, but I won't leave it in if it particularly breaks the game. An example of one game-breaking bug, we should say, is that Walt's skill reduces his move to 0, so he can only attack 2 enemies that are in range when he attacks. If you reset the game while Walt is attacking the first enemy, then when you reload the game, he will continue his attack on the first enemy, but also get all his movement back. So he could move and then attack again. So fixing that was a case of, this is an unlikely thing, like a person resetting specifically this time, but it's one exploit that we just really wanted to patch out to stop the unit from being too good.
It's good design, and it's good quality assurance testing, essentially. You want to make sure that even in the most unlikely of situations, the game will not produce some sort of undesired situation.
One such problem that we had before was... after we modified the way the game saved the data, because on the surface, this might still look similar to the original game it was based on, but underneath, this game has been modified so extensively that surface coding really does not reflect all the changes that have been made. When we modified that save data, if you reset the game after saving, and then you moved a unit, you would get a game over. That was kind of a bug that we couldn't really have, and thankfully, a lot of the bugs we encounter these days are mostly minor things that don't really mean anything.
A game over bug like that kind of prevents you from playing the game, I suppose, doesn't it?
Yes, and we only realized it recently because we decided to start doing testing again. We'd mostly put testing on hold while we were putting together the game. When we started doing testing again, and the players got to chapter 2, and it's like, hey, if I don't skip this cutscene, the game just crashes. Is that meant to happen?
The way that the game works in terms of what we call the event system, it all runs through what is essentially a scripting language. It's not an actual programming language per se, or not like a defined one such as C++, C# or anything like that. But scripting language, obviously, if you code something wrong or make a mistake, or if the game just doesn't like you that day, you may find yourself with some sort of errors, a crash. It may go back to the title screen. There's a number of things that can happen every once in a while. And debugging is sometimes difficult, sometimes easy to solve, but usually never fun.
Generally, the process of putting anything new into the game is we put it in once, it doesn't insert, put it in again, it doesn't insert, then we finally get it to insert, and then we figure out what went wrong when it actually inserted, because we never inserted it right the first time. And I remember one bug that I had was that the way our folder structure is set up for inserting things into the game, we have A's and B's. B's are all inserted into free space in the game, so that it doesn't override anything, and A's will modify stuff that already existed in the game. I accidentally set one of the B things to A, and it overrode a chunk of the game that no one actually picked up until a little while later when we were doing a bunch of tests, and it finally came up to us and it was like, oh right, yes, that explains that, yes.
Yeah, the worst part is when a bug is introduced a long time ago and nobody catches it, and then you discover it. It could be weeks, could be a month later, something like that, and you have to go back and try to isolate it, and there are regular backups taken, but when it's a month old that the bug exists, it's hard to bring yourself to essentially restore a backup that's 1 month old. It's not a fun thing to do. So usually you have to try and work around it in some fashion.
So part of what's going on here is there are two objectives to this chapter. To reach Hector's cell within 10 turns and to seize the throne. One of the main things is introducing this information to the player without making it sound video game. So at the beginning of the chapter, when Chad is talking with Roy and Roy says, you're the only ones who can save Hector, to Burke and Ellen, who are both healers. That is me telling the player that they need to bring either of the two there. But I can't say you've got 10 minutes or 10 turns to do so, because a turn is not a defined amount of time. And if I say minutes, they might think they actually have real time that they have to do it in. So I just have to say he didn't look like he would last long, and sort of hope that would give a hint to the player to speed things up. A lot of problems that we can wind up having in the game is text constraints. For example, if a name is too long, then it will break the table, and we don't have infinite space for an infinite amount of names. And so when I was doing essentially the chapter objectives, I had to say save Hector and seize, instead of save Hector in 10 turns, because then I would have to leave off the seize bar. And players might assume that saving Hector was the main requirement that they had to do for the chapter. If I just said seize, they might not think that they actually have to go save Hector and would just let him die. And then there would be a feeling that, well, I thought if I just seized, then he would be automatically saved. It's the kind of feeling that it's hard to bring across all the information we need, because we do try very hard when writing, and I'm the head writer as well, to not make it sound like it's a video game. We're trying to make it sound realistic.
Tutorializing is one of the harder things in game design from my experience. Mostly because you want to give the player some agency, essentially. You want them to some extent, learn the game. It's okay if they fail a little bit, but you want them to understand. You don't want it to feel like they're failing and not understanding why. So, as Aaron's saying, striking the balance between either telling the player outright how long they have to save him, or letting them discover on their own what the lost condition is, it's a hard balance to strike.
Ultimately, in this kind of situation, the thing I want to do the most is to put a timer up on the screen. But currently we lack the programming knowledge to do something like that in this game. And that's something else that we ran into when it came to modifying the existing game. A lot of the technology that we're showing off now are not things that were done in the original game. In the original game, strength and magic were one stat. In the original game, units couldn't use the weapons they could use. In the original game, for example, skills didn't exist, and they make up a very important factor of what's going to happen and go into the chapter. So it's very different. Once more saying, it may look similar to how the original game looked, but there are so many different things that have been changed that it really just...
I was going to say, for example, the original game fit on 8 megabytes. Is that correct? I believe it was an 8 megabyte game originally. What size is the game now?
The current game is 20 megabytes.
20 megabytes. So more than doubled the amount of game's code and insertions.
Yeah, it just sort of happened that way, where getting English text into the game took up a lot of space, because one thing to understand when you're modifying a game like this is it's not like you can just overwrite the original stuff. Data exists on a table of pointers, and if you willy-nilly just change the size of everything, the pointers are all going to be pointing to somewhere that's wrong, and then everything just sort of falls apart right then and there. So you just have to add to the end and find free space to do it in.
Yeah, luckily the ability to expand the game past the original 8 megabyte limit does exist. So you are able to add extra content at the end of everything and sort of leave the original game intact, and all you do is insert your modifications over top the original game.
Not that we haven't modified a number of things in the game. I do want to point out, because it took incredibly long time to get this done, when Urk talked to Hector and essentially healed him and rescued him, Hector stepped onto Urk and then disappeared, much like what happens when you rescue a unit. Except the unit that you rescue doesn't disappear. To get that to work was incredibly difficult. Originally, Hector just stood there, and it sort of became a point where it's like, well, I don't think the player really knows what they're supposed to do in this case. And then it changed up once more, and it was like, well...
we have the ability to get him to step onto Urk's tile and disappear, basically, right?
Right, but it sort of became, okay, well, I know how basically to do this. How do I make him always know where Urk is talking to him from? Because Urk could be talking to him from the sides, or he could be talking to him from the top. And if you talk to him from the sides and it's only set to move him at the top, then it's going to look incredibly strange.
Yes, the scripting for character movement is either done via specifying a coordinate on the map to go to, or telling the character to move to another character. So making specific movement instructions for a character depending on where they're being talked to from is a bigger challenge than one might imagine.
Eventually we had to just create a new line of code that would get him to step onto Urk. And then the other difficulty was, well, he successfully rescued him, but now Urk is just carrying around this unit who's lowering his stats, and he can't really do anything. So we had to invent another line of code that would wipe Hector from the map while preserving him in the game's data. So the game would know that, yes, you saved him and he's alive, but there would also be this shift where it looks like Urk has indeed saved him, and it doesn't leave the player confused as to what's just happened.
Basically, there's a lot of scripting going on behind the scenes to make sure that the entire scenario plays out as desired and not break. That's the majority of scripting.
One visual problem earlier, at the beginning of the chapter, was that after you finish talking with Chad, he's not there on the map, he just sort of pops into existence a second later. I think there's a little bit more we still need to edit to clean that up and make Urk exist there before and make it look more natural.
Yeah, thankfully a lot of the scripting behind this is simple enough. Getting characters to load on a map and move around is not difficult at all. It's the more complicated things, generally revolving around events where characters are talking, moving around in a scripted manner. And we'll see a little bit of that momentarily when the lead character, Royce, moves to that throne and uses the seize command. Generally, that's where the majority of scripting occurs, and that's the most likely place for things to go wrong.
So it's worth pointing out that for the previous 2 maps, simply seizing the throne has been the thing that ends the chapter. And typically that's remained okay, but what I wanted to do with this chapter was to use it as sort of a leaping off point so that the player at this point realizes, okay, things are really going to be different. This isn't just a new skin or a new design that's being put on. This actually means something, things are actually going to be different. So typically, when the chapter was originally designed, with the original map, once Roy sees the throne, the chapter would end, Hector would have died, and Roy would move on to the next chapter. Now, we have Urk here who tells Roy that the character is in critical condition, and they get to have a bit more of a conversation and reveal things. But unlike what happens in the original game, the chapter is now not over. That was the trigger for the next events, but the chapter now becomes an escape chapter.
Yeah, what happens now is that Roy and his army must leave the map before they are overwhelmed by foes that are simply too powerful for them to take on at this point in time. So you have to an escape zone is specified on the map, and you have to move all of the units over onto those tiles in order to get them to leave.
So there is the dragon there. I originally wanted to do something a lot more cool with his entrance, to make like the screen tint red and put pillars of fire to shoot out, but it just became something we really couldn't do, so now he just is heralded by his terrifying roar.
We also saw there was a cursor that appeared in the top corner. That is the specified escape zone.
And Roy specifically says, I want everyone to escape.
Mm-hmm. And then what occurs now is that a allied force, the green units, like Hector was, will spawn and act as a shield for the more powerful units that will be appearing from the right side of the screen near that dragon character.
If the player was escaping on their own without that wall, they would more than likely just lose. Now, I will say it is not a requirement that everyone gets out. In some games, having not everyone escape would lead to the player losing the units that didn't escape. I believe more in incentivizing my players with rewards rather than with punishment. So, escaping units that aren't going to give the player a little bit of cash. And those generals down there will continue to spawn more and more generals each turn. Eventually they will overwhelm you, and your unit's just not strong enough at this time to actually fight and defeat them.
Specifically, generals are the upgraded class for the armor knights that we've been seeing so far. They have a lot more defense, way more than most units here are going to be able to handle. So they are essentially a very visual notification that the player is not meant to fight at this point, but is instead meant to leave.
Another indication of the strength of the dragon is that the units that spawned in to defend you are more paladins, which are Force units, and heroes, who are with shields. These are also advanced units, so it sort of gives the player an idea that the strength of the dragon is not something that the majority of their army, which are still basic units, is ready to fight. And when those units wind up being killed, as you see the dragon wipe out that one unit, basically one shot, it gives the player the idea that I'm not yet able to fight back. I need to leave or my units will die. And this is a case of integrating the story with the gameplay. If I'd had the player chased by weaker units and had units just running around, then it wouldn't really give the feeling that the player needed to escape. And I figured this really does give it makes sure the player doesn't try to game the system by seeing how many generals they can kill and gain experience and all that stuff. There is a very heavy feeling here that if you don't look right, you die.
Yes, for reference, in the original game, people who played the original game will recall that the dragon unit that has appeared only originally appears around chapter 12, I believe, in the original game. This is chapter 3, so to see one as powerful as it is this early in the game is definitely a hint to anybody that has played the game before that you should not be fighting. But we're actually coming up on the end of the chapter at this point with everybody escaping. Do you want to say anything about the scope of the project as a whole, like as you're approaching the final stages?
Sure. The project has sort of ceased growing in scope more because I've expended everything I could reasonably do. And
I think we've touched upon everything at this point.
If I made this any longer, I think it would be in serious risk of fatiguing itself. And I mean, it's
creep
already
as well.
Yeah, and that's something that you really had to look around more, and that's half the reason I rely on using consulting, is because you will tell me,
Is
no,
this a good idea?
can't.
No, it's probably not.
So, the original game was only around 35 chapters long. Our game is 46 chapters long. We have more classes, we have more items, we have more characters, we have more of everything.
New mechanics, new characters, new maps. Yeah, it's fairly impressive what you and the other members of the team that are not here commenting with me today have accomplished over these 6 years. It's really come together in the last 3, maybe even I would just say like the last year. It's really stepped up. There's been a heck of a lot of effort put into it, and I'm really impressed. I'm looking forward to playing the full thing when you do finally finish it.
Well, the intent is to release the full game this New Year's Eve. That would be Australian. So there's the day behind me.
Yeah.
But, so our intent is more to get it out this year. It was sort of a goal to get this completely finished by this year. And we're most of the way there. A lot of the things have been cleaned up, and there's really only a few little minor things that need to be handled, but
Yep.
we have a good team around it. So thank you all for watching this, and hopefully you'll be able to play the full game on New Year's. That'll be a nice little late Christmas present for you.
Yep. Aaron, I'm very happy with what's been accomplished here at this point. So yeah, I'm glad to see that we're almost there.
And we will hopefully see you with more updates next time.
All right, thank you.
Goodbye.